I'm loving our Kingdom Movement series. We've been walking through the book of Acts. What we've been seeing is that men and women have been being used by God for gospel advancement. Literally, the kingdom of God moving forward. And it's not just a book that we read about. It's not just a thing we read about from 2,000 years ago. It's a book that we're actually seeing lived out through our everyday life as everyday missionaries. And so thank you for joining us tonight to fight for your joy in the text, in Communitas. Now, I just am curious, how many leaders are here tonight? Anybody a leader out there? Who's afraid to even raise their hand? It's like, I'm just gonna kind of raise my hand, right? I actually believe that you're a leader. Every single one of you. Here's the reason why I believe the Spirit of God is in you. If you trust and treasure Jesus, He's given you a spirit. And that you're leading. Now, you might be leading unintentionally. I'd rather you lead intentionally. I'd rather you recognize the way in which you're leading, because here's what I believe. I believe people are watching you. I don't mean that in a creepy way, but like seriously, on Facebook, in your neighborhood, at your work, in your class, people are watching you and they're looking to see the way in which you live your life. Because if you go to Vintage, we have a number one value. You know what it is? We believe there's more joy in Jesus than anyone or anything else this world has to offer. And so the reality is this: everyone in the world wants to be happier tomorrow than they are today, and they're watching you to see if you have something that they don't have. That's what makes you a leader. And so I actually kind of think that every Sunday morning and evening that we gather, we're actually doing leadership development. That's what church is. It's developing us as sons and as daughters of the King to go into the world to be the everyday missionary that He's called you and I to be, wherever it is that we go. And so today's a really special leadership development day for us, because we're gonna do something called leadership sensitivity training. You ever had one of these at work before? Like, I tried to find a funny video. Here's the problem. All of them are inappropriate. Like, every sensitivity video should not be shown in church, let alone seen. So just save your time, don't YouTube it. It's not worth, any of the videos are worth your time. But here's my question. Of all of you leaders, which I think you all are, how many of you guys are too sensitive? Raise your hand. Don't lie, you're in church. Who's too sensitive out there? How many of you guys are not sensitive enough? Raise your hand. Now, typically there's like a gender divide there, just for the record. And I love the wives looking at the husbands, right? Like, who's not sensitive enough? How many of you guys are too sensitive and not sensitive enough sometimes at the exact same time? Right? Like, that's me. Like, depends what we're talking about. And I actually think that we need to learn from Paul and from Barnabas today. Luke is our narrator through the book of Acts. He's not gonna pick a side as to what we should leave with, but I actually think we can learn from both of them in this context of leadership sensitivity that all of us need to grow. And here's my summary statement for tonight. I believe that each and every one of us has been designed by God to play a role in His kingdom. To see kingdom movement happen, we must all actually be ready to move. It means we must be sensitive to what He's doing, must be sensitive to each other to play the role. And if you don't play your leadership role in the kingdom of God, the kingdom will not move as fast or as far as God intends it to go. Don't miss this. We need each other. God has entrusted us with His Spirit and with the gospel and with the good news to do something with it, not just to high five each other, not just to sing songs, not just to get to heaven someday, but to bring as many people with us as possible. And so part of why we pray and watch as a church, pray and watch just simply means this, that we pray open-handed. We say, God, we're open to whatever you invite us into. We're praying and we're watching so we might know where to step, when to step. We need the Spirit to lead us. And here's the good news in kingdom movement, because I don't want anyone to leave tonight feeling burdened or pressured by their role in the kingdom. We get to do it together. You're not alone in this journey. We're fighting for our joy in Communitas as a community for His glory and for our good. Now, if you don't like people, it's probably not a good news that you get to do it together, right? Some of you guys love individual sports. You're like tennis, golfers. You're like, I just want to be left alone. But following Christ is a team sport. We desperately need each other. I tell couples all the time, I think sometimes they miss this in premarital counseling. Marriage is a team sport also, right? Like, you need two people. Here's the problem with marriage, or really any team sport. You know when your marriage first got hindered? When you joined it? I mean, think about that. Like, the issues with your marriage started when you said, I want to marry you, or yes, because you came as someone that was either too opinionated, under-opinionated, too sensitive, not enough sensitivity. Who have I offended already? Anybody? I mean, I'm working hard here, right? Because here's the reality. In this team sport that we call the church, the reality is this, is all of us at times are too sensitive or not sensitive enough, and as a result, we're gonna offend each other. We're gonna hurt each other's feelings. We're literally gonna step on each other's toes. But here's the good news of the gospel: the DJ doesn't ever turn the music off, ever. So pay attention to what He's doing, what He's in the middle of, because God puts us as a team because we are better together. We desperately need each other. We need each other or the kingdom movement won't actually take place. And so here's my ask. We gotta remain sensitive to each other, church. For God's glory, for our joy, to each other, and ultimately to the Spirit of God, or we won't know what to do and when or how to do it. Now, if you have your Bibles, follow to Acts chapter 15. And again, maybe you're a guest with us tonight. You've missed the first. We'll give you a little bit of context and review. So before we get to 15, I think context is key, or this chapter won't make sense. And so here's the context. Acts chapter 10 through 14. Jesus has come. He's risen again. He's given his spirit to his disciples. He said, you go into all the nations, make disciples, baptizing them. You're going to go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And so in Acts chapter 10 through 14, we see Paul's first missionary journey. And this is kind of the location it was. I put a star here to say this is kind of where we were. He was leaving from Antioch. He went to Cyprus. He went up to Lystra, Antioch, all throughout Galatia, and then went back to Antioch. That's where we started. That's where these last 4 chapters have been. So if you missed the last 4 chapters, no worries. Now you're good. You got it? Okay, that's where we've been. Lots of great fruit. Gentiles are coming to faith. Jews are coming to faith. People are coming in droves, and that's what we're seeing. And then we got to Acts chapter 15, which was last week. In Acts chapter 15, we see the beginning of this expansion. This is where we're going to be for the next few chapters. And in Acts 15, we see Paul play another role. Now, Paul's one of the key characters we're going to read about today. Who remembers Paul when he was Saul? Anybody? Okay. So who was Saul? Saul was actually a murderer of the church. He literally persecuted the church. Back in chapter 7 and 8, Stephen, who was the first martyr of the church, the first one that laid down his life, Paul, who was then Saul, was there going, take him out. Take him out. And yet something happens to Saul. On the road to Damascus, in chapter 9, he meets Jesus face to face. And in that context, Jesus says, Paul, Paul, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? What are you doing? And in that moment, he gives his life to Christ. He gets off the throne of his heart and he starts to treasure him and to follow him. He goes away to Damascus for a few years and then he comes back. He's in Tarsus for up to 10 years, being trained by the Spirit, growing in ministry and in wisdom. And then he goes on and he leads this missionary journey throughout these really 2 to 3 years. Now, when Paul went to a new place, what message did he preach? Anybody know? The gospel. It's like the only message he had, right? We were dead in our sin, but God made us alive, and that makes us what? Happy. Makes us happy people. Paul says, I want you to be happier tomorrow than you are today. Meet Jesus. He is the core to your happiness. We often use this stool as a metaphor at Vintage Grace for the throne of our heart. And so last week, as he was preaching the gospel, we saw Gentiles are coming to faith, and now there's a tension. What do the Jewish believers do with the Gentile believers? Remember that? So there's this tension. What are the core ingredients of the gospel? We use mashed potatoes as an example. If you didn't see the sermon, you can watch it online. But 3 core ingredients for mashed potatoes, what are they? The first one is potatoes. Then you need milk, and then you need butter. How much? A lot. 1 cube for every potato, okay? And so that's how you make it. Again, that was in the text last week. Don't forget, right? Mashed potatoes, 3 core ingredients. But what was happening is there was tension in the church that these Jewish believers were coming and they were saying, no, actually, in your mashed potatoes, you need garlic salt. Remember that? Now, do you need garlic salt in mashed potatoes? No. You only need those 3 things. You can add them if you want. And we use garlic salt. In fact, it says on the back of my garlic salt, circumcision. My wife sent me a text this week and said, I'm tired of opening up our pantry and saying circumcision, right? Because that's what happens when you're a senior pastor's wife, is you get all sort of metaphors all around the house. But this was the metaphor. You don't actually need garlic salt to get the gospel. You just need those 3 things. And those 3 things were desperate, dependent. We need God. We are apart from him. Every world religion is trying to earn their way to heaven. And the beauty of the gospel is that God came to us because we couldn't get to him. And so these Jews that were saying, no, you need circumcision. Paul and Barnabas and the Jerusalem Council says, no, you don't. You don't need anything other than faith by grace, and that's it. That's the only way in which we're saved. Now, they did say, remember, don't put taco seasoning in your mashed potatoes, right? Metaphorically speaking. I got more text messages this week of people that put taco seasoning in their mashed potatoes. I don't know why. You guys need to find more things to do with your life, right? But the point of taco seasoning on the back of my taco, it says sexual immorality, blood, animals strangled, idolatry, right? These were all things that the early disciples said, hey, you don't need to be circumcised to get the gospel, but you can't live this way either. You can't live a life of sin. You've got to understand on the throne of your heart, that's a seat for Jesus and him alone. No other way to heaven. And so Paul was preaching this gospel in every city that he went. Now, Paul wasn't the only guy. He had a sidekick. What was his name? Barnabas, right? Now, part of this I love. They were a great team. Paul was one of those guys that he would kick butt and take names. Barnabas had a nickname called the Son of Encouragement. And here's the reason why. Because after he kicked your butt, Barnabas would be like, hey, did Paul kick too hard? Like, are you okay, right? Like, there was this beautiful symbiotic relationship, I believe, between Paul and Barnabas. They led so well together. They were Batman and Batman. They were Robin and Robin working together for the glory of God. Now, Barnabas, we know from chapter 4. He was a kingdom laborer too. Chapter 4, verse 36 is where he first steps onto the scene. And in 36 and 37, we see this, that he was all in for the gospel. You know how we know that? He sold his land. See, something's only worth what you're willing to pay for it. Barnabas says, I'm all in for the gospel. I don't just sing songs like Christ is enough. I think he is. Whatever it costs, time, treasure, talent, Barnabas is in. And it's in chapter 4, he's called the son of encouragement. Barnabas also really believes in second chances. Remember why? Because when Paul becomes Paul, when he goes from Saul to Paul, he goes to Jerusalem to meet the disciples. And he shows up. And how do the disciples receive Saul at the time? Are they like, yes? No, they're like, what are you doing here? You killed my friend. I don't want you a part of my team. And who steps up for Saul and says, wait, he's the real deal. His conversion real. Who was that? Anybody remember? Barnabas. Because Barnabas believes in second chances. And so Barnabas and Saul have this great relationship as he becomes Paul. They do ministry together. That was in chapter 9, verse 26. As they go on that missionary journey where they literally pull out, the garlic salt and all of these things, and they have the conversation of the gospel, they invited a friend to go with them. Barnabas wanted to invite someone that he was close with, so he invited John Mark. Now again, I'm sharing all this because the text doesn't make sense unless we get the background, right? And so John Mark, we met him before, chapter 12, verse 12. He's got a home in Jerusalem. It's not his home, it's his mom's home. I think that's really, really important because I think sometimes my kids are like, well, this is my home. No, you don't pay the mortgage, it's my home, and I let you live here, right? And so John Mark is living with his mother, right? He's kind of grown up in the faith. He's grown up around Communitas, around the gospel. John Mark's mom was actually, I think, one of the very first home church locations. They're in Jerusalem. We saw that in chapter 12. Chapter 13, we see that he gets invited to go on the missionary journey, to go spread the gospel. Now, is that exciting? Totally. But is there a cost to going on a missionary journey? Yeah. In fact, last time we left Paul, if you remember, he was like beaten on the side of the road, left for dead. They thought he was out. And so they need people that are going to stand with them, that are, again, willing to pay the cost no matter what it is in time and treasure and talent and health and in wealth. But John Mark in chapter 13, verse 13, he bails. Now, Luke doesn't really tell us the scenario. It just things got hard, and for whatever reason, John Mark takes off. And so that's the context. 2-3 years of the first missionary journey has gone by. Now we've seen the Jerusalem Council go by, and now we're getting Acts chapter 15. That was the introduction. Are you ready? We got 3 paragraphs. I hope you guys got a lot of time tonight. Here we go. Acts chapter 15, starting in verse 36. We're going to do 3 little paragraphs today. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, hey, let's go back and return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord. Let's see how they are. And Barnabas wanted to take with them John, called Mark. But Paul thought best not to take one with them who had already drawn away from them in Pamphylia and had not gone on to them to do the work. And there arose this sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed to Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Father, that's my ask. My ask for us as Vintage Grace is that you would strengthen us, that you would speak boldly to us, spirits, that we might see where we're too sensitive and where we're not sensitive enough. That we might see what you're calling us to so that we can play our role today and tomorrow and however long you have us on this earth. May we be faithful for your glory and for our good. We ask these things. And everybody said, amen. Leaders must be sensitive. Leaders must be sensitive? Is it an exclamation point or is it a question mark? What do you think? Yes, that's the answer. Now, we've talked about it this way. We believe theology matters at Vintage Grace, do we not? Again, I don't know if you're going to find someone that loves the Bible, that's more of a Bible thumper than me, but here's the problem with my friends that are great theologians. If you have the right theology, you have the wrong tone and the wrong timing, guess what? No one cares about your theology. It's not one or the other, it's all of the above. We must believe the right thing, but we must talk to people, walk with people, sit with them, and journey with them. And so leaders, we must be sensitive. We're going to learn from Paul and Barnabas. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, can we go back? Let's return to go see the brothers in every city where we used to proclaim the word. Dare I say Paul's being, I think, really sensitive right now in a good way. Paul's saying, guys, let's go. Now, I'm speaking as a church planter. Now, I don't know what my life is going to look like. I have no intention to go anywhere, but I could imagine not seeing some of you for 2, 3, 4 years. I love you and I care about you, and I just want to go back, and I want to know how you're doing. I can't jump on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook. What do I have to do if I want to go see you? I have to go see you. I actually have to get out of here and go there. And maybe that's a beautiful thing for Communitas. Maybe we can learn from that alone, just being face to face with people. So we can actually be in relationship. And so Paul says, Barnabas, let's go. Barnabas says, absolutely, let's go see how they are. Barnabas wanted to take with them John, called Mark. But Paul doesn't like this. Now let's think about this just for a moment. As Barnabas wants to take John Mark, do we think Barnabas is right? Like, does he deserve a second chance? Does everybody need a second chance? Is that good? Yeah, but Paul doesn't like that. So again, we can see that's a good thing, but Paul says this: it's best not to take the one who withdrew from us. Guys, we're going on a rugged mission. We're going on a trip in our favorite rocket ship going through the skies, little Einsteins, right? Like, we're going. And so you got to be ready. And I need to know that you're going to have my back because I'm going to be beaten down for my faith, Paul says. Are you with me or not? And John Mark in the past has what? Not. And so Paul says this: there's no way. Remember John 13:13? John left. He left us. There's no way he's going with us. Now, this debate between Paul and Barnabas was not a little argument. This is what the text says. There arose a sharp disagreement, so sharp that they separated from each other. Guys, this is intense. This isn't like a willy-nilly argument. This isn't something that they're just going to brush under the rug. This is a big deal, such a big deal that they split. Now, again, this is not a marriage covenant. They didn't say, we're going to be in this till death do us part. And there's a distinction between types of covenants. But they did say is, we're in this journey of communitas. We're in it to win it. We're going hard. And this drove a wedge between the relationship, so much so to where they actually split. Barnabas took Mark. Now, Barnabas and Mark have a family relationship. Colossians tells us they were cousins. I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I do think family relationships can totally blind us from the truth, can they not? They kind of mess with our perspective a little bit. I think on some level, Barnabas, who was a man of second chances, he was a gifted leader, he was an encourager. I need Barnabas in my life. Anyone else need a Barnabas tonight? There's a couple here at Vintage Grace. Just tell me afterwards. I'll just introduce you to them. They just bless you with words. They encourage you. They pick you up when you're down. We all need Barnabases in our life. But in this context, I think Barnabas missed the really important part. So we need people that will persevere. We need people that even when things get hard, they're not just going to quit. It's easy to encourage someone when things are going well, but John Mark had abandoned them. He had left them. And I think Barnabas was blinded by his family connection. He was blinded by his love. Sometimes I think we can actually be too loving, where we don't actually want to share the truth because we're afraid it's going to hurt, but sometimes that's not helpful. Sometimes it's most loving and most helpful to say, hey, you're a Dodgers fan. That's not good for you, right? Like, because I love you, I want to pull you out of that area of darkness and lead you into light. Amen? So he chooses Mark. They go off to Cyprus. But Paul chooses Silas. Now, Silas and Paul now form kind of the new dream team. I want you to see this. They stay connected as a community. They're not solo rangers. They're not off running at their own speed. Paul picks Silas. Why? I think Silas has been a perseverer of the faith. Silas is also a Roman citizen. Paul's going to go into the Jewish synagogue, but there's going to be moments he's going to be battling with Greeks and with Gentiles and having another Roman citizen. We're going to see that in chapter 16 is going to be very valuable. And so Paul chooses Silas and they depart, having been commended by the brothers. So Luke is trying to be an unbiased narrator, right? He's like, hey, let's just learn from both them. But Luke shows his cards right here a little bit. Only one of the two pairs gets the blessing of the Spirit and the disciples. Who is it? It's Paul. It's Paul here. And so Paul and Silas, being commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord, they went through Syria and Cilicia to strengthen the churches. Now, Barnabas used to be commended too, back when he was with Paul in chapter 14. See, it's kind of like a sign of fellowship, a sign of sealing, a sign of saying, we're with you, we think you're doing the right thing, go. And so they go. And I just think it's imperative for us, church, to learn what we can as leaders. Because all of you are a leader. Where are you taking people? When people see your life, if they were to follow you, now you might not think you're a leader, but people are following. Your kids, your friends, your family, your church, your life group, where are you taking them? Let's look at Paul and Barnabas, even before this fight. I think they understood that they weren't even worth following themselves, right? They believe that there's one hero to every story, and it's not even Paul or Barnabas. They recognize that they were just men. Remember in chapter 14, we see this reality that they are doing miracles in the name of Jesus, and the Greeks start to worship them. Remember that text? And they say, you must be like the son of Zeus and the son of Hermes. And they say, men, why are you doing these things? We son of encouragement. I threw in son of thunder. Paul wasn't one. That was John, right? The son of Zebedee. But I think Paul was like a son of thunder. See, Barnabas, again, he was the encourager. We got this. Come on. Paul's the guy that's like, life's short, hell's hot. Let's go. We got work to do. I don't have time to encourage you. The Spirit of God can do that on his time. Someone's perishing over there. We got to get over there. Again, the reason why they're called the sons of thunder is because Jesus is saying, what are we going to do about these people? The disciples are like, what do we do about these sinners? And the sons of thunder are like, I know what we can do. We can nuke them, send down thunder from heaven and just take them out, right? I only laugh because you probably thought that too, right? Like all sorts of types of leaders. I don't want you to be a Paul or a Barnabas. I want you to be a Michael. I want you to be a Dave. Because the reality is only you can be the person that God created and called you to be. There's only one Kirk, the one that he created, the way he created. And here's what I love. These men say, don't worship us. We're just men of nature like you. But as leaders, here's what we do want for you. We want you to turn away from the things of this world. We want you to turn to God. We want you to be happier. We want to give you something that's going to help with that. And so this is the context of Paul and Barnabas as leaders. They've been good leaders. They're fighting, they're not getting along, but they've been good leaders to this point. And so a couple things I think we can learn. The first one is this. One commentator said it this way. He goes, this really feels like a judgment call. This doesn't feel like it's a theological issue that's going to ruin someone's faith. It does feel more like garlic salt than taco seasoning. Now that being said, to Paul, this was a big deal. This was a huge deal. This was about hypocrisy. This is about perseverance. We see that in Galatians, specifically this idea that Barnabas at times, I think his love for his cousin, for other people got the best of him. And if we're going to say that we're all in for the gospel, but in the first chance we get to be threatened by something else and we run away, that's hypocrisy. That's not all in for the gospel. That's all in when it's convenient. That's what we call Vintage Grace one-cheek faith, where you're kind of sharing the throne of your heart with Jesus. You're like, well, you can have it sometimes, but not all the time. And so in this context, I think we see Paul, again, frustrated. That's why he splits. He says, go ahead and you go do your thing. But Barnabas, you go do that, but I'm going to continue on. And so, church, I think we need to recognize, when is the right time to stand but not push? What's worth having a conversation about? Of course we're going to have conversations about these, but sometimes if someone really wants garlic salt and mashed potatoes, guess what? They can have mashed potatoes. Go ahead, that's okay. And they continue on in their ministry. What I love, I believe, is that trials are often most clear in the rearview mirror. You notice that? You live your life and you look back 2, 3, 4 years later, you're like, that's what God was doing. And you can usually find joy 3 years later that God was doing something. My heart for you, though, is that you would find joy today in the midst of the rubbish. That it wouldn't take 3 years. I think we can learn that from these leaders. I wonder if Paul was saying, man, in that moment, Barnabas, you're wrong. Because let's be honest, Paul, of course, is going to tell him as they split, you're wrong, right? You're wrong. But I trust that God's going to use you. Because at the end of Paul's life, it's pretty clear that Paul is a fan of Barnabas and John Mark still. Just because they split doesn't mean that he's given up on them. Paul writes a letter to Timothy, who we're going to meet in just a little bit. And with Timothy, he says this, Luke alone is with me. But guess what? At the end of my life, go get Mark. The one that I used to think was worthless in ministry, go get John Mark and bring him to me, because he is very what? Useful. He's useful. Just because he does it differently or not the exact way that he wants doesn't mean that he's useless. He says this in 1 Corinthians, is it only Barnabas and I, Paul, who have the right to raise money? So Paul was a tent maker. Well, there were times where his tent making business didn't go well. He needed support from the church. And they would give him resources because he couldn't take the ferry to get over to the next city that he was going to visit. Barnabas also, he says, is worthy of support. Support him. I believe in him. Does that sound like a guy that hates this man that's never going to talk to him again? No, he believes in him. He believes that Barnabas is going to make much of the king, even if in Paul's mind he's not going to do it as well as he will. Does that make sense? And so he says that. In fact, Colossians, we read it earlier, he says, welcome John Mark. Welcome. He doesn't say kick him out. He doesn't say he's a knucklehead. He is a knucklehead. That's not his point. His point is, if he's making much of Jesus, and here's the point, leaders, we must be sensitive. Why? Because I think teamwork is what makes the dream work. That we need each other. That we actually can't do this on our own. That when we wear shirts that are desperate and dependent, that's not just vertically before Jesus, that's horizontally before each other. We don't exist as Vintage Grace unless we all play our role together. This last week, one of my pastors, Rick Dunn from Tennessee, came out and spent 2 days with us. All day today, I've been texting one of my pastors in Southern California. Why? Because every pastor needs a pastor. Because all of us need people that we're submitting to, that we're fighting for our joy, that we're bouncing things off of, but that we're actually looking to do this life together. Why? Because I think taco seasoning is real. Because I think, metaphorically speaking, sin is attractive. We settle for it all the time. We don't even know sometimes we need people in our lives that can come and say, Drew, do you recognize this? Do you see this? Do you see where we're going? And so Paul needs that, which is why I think that Paul continues on to say the family win matters. We say it this way, that the most important name on your jersey, we love football and whatever sports season it is, the most important name on your jersey is the name on the front of the jersey, not the name on the back. But in this individualistic society, we're all about who am I? What am I about? Jesus, that's it. That's who I'm about. That's what I live for. And so God designed Communitas for his glory and for our good. And so we're going to meet a guy that's all about the family win. Paul then goes off. So we must be sensitive to other believers. We also must be sensitive to the yet to believe. And so Paul on his journey goes to Derbe and he goes to Lystra and he meets this man named Timothy. Timothy is the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer. Got it? He's also the son, specifically, of a Gentile man, a Greek man who was not a believer. I say not a believer because Luke doesn't tell us he's a believer. So you've got a marriage here of one believer and one not. And as a result of being born in a Greek family, he was not circumcised. And so that's who he is. Now let me give you a little bit of an example. Josiah, you're wearing a red shirt. Can I pick on you for a second? Okay? No, just stay there. Just stand up. You're beautiful right there, buddy. Okay? Now, Josiah's wearing red. Josiah, I don't like red. I don't think red's a good color. I don't like it at all. I mean, yeah, it's one of our main vintage colors, but I don't like the color red. Now, is that my problem or Josiah's problem if I'm not going to be his friend because he has a red shirt on? Whose fault is that? Whose fault is that? Whose problem is it? It's mine. It's my problem. Talk about immature, right? Like, who's the adult in the relationship, right? But if Josiah loves the Father, if Josiah says, you know what, Drew, we're a part of this communitas. We're part of this family, this thing called church. Guess what? My problem, because it's not his problem, I don't like red, but out of his love and difference to me, he says, no, this is a family problem. There's no longer they problems or his problems. It's we. It's not me or he. It's we. And so in this context, this is key because Timothy shows up on the scene. I think Timothy is a younger son, a younger man of faith in this context. He's the son of this Jewish woman, a believer, and a father who was Greek. Now, he was well spoken of by all the brothers. This is important because they didn't have like Facebook. They weren't sharing notes. That means that people in Lystra and Derbe and Iconium, and they all talked together. They knew that Timothy was this young man that was growing in his faith, that he was a leader like the rest of us. And so Paul gets to this journey and he says, I want to reach out to that young man. I want to go spend some time with him and I want him to be on my team. You think that's going to fire up the kid in the red shirt, right? He's going to be like, yeah, I want to be on Paul's team. I want to go wherever Paul's going. Now, we have a statement that we've used around here. It's simply this, and I don't know who said it, but that we will do anything short of sin for the sake of the gospel. Do you believe that? Anything short of sin for the sake of the gospel. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but I hope you believe that. We sing songs like Christ is enough. Barnabas, talk is cheap. Barnabas did it, right? Would we do anything short of sin for the sake of the gospel? And so Paul meets Timothy. He likes him. He wants to train him up. But here's the problem. Paul wanted Timothy to come with him. Now, Paul was going to go to the Jew first, but then to the Greek. He was also going to the Gentile. Now, the Jews were like me. They were immature, older, whatever it might be, and they didn't like red shirts. They didn't like red shirts at all. And so Paul tells Timothy, he says, brother, I want you to be on my team, but I need you to take your red shirt off. Now, don't literally do that. Keep your red shirt on. You're good, right? But he says, we can't have that. Why? He's like, what's wrong with the red shirt? Nothing's wrong with the red shirt. The problem is we're going to go hang out with people and minister in the gospel context, and just because you have red, they're not going to listen to you. Like, how immature are they? That's their problem. But church, if we want to reach people, guess what? Their problems become our problems. We actually love them in such a way that we will become one of them. And so Paul trains up Timothy and he recruits him. But I want to be very clear here because I think we could read this next verse very fast and be like, oh yeah, that's cute, that's good, red shirt, whatever. Listen to what happens. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and so he took him and he circumcised him. Again, this is garlic salt, guys. This isn't what's needed. He didn't need to be circumcised. Timothy was not 8 days old like most Jewish boys were. He was a young man. Will you do anything short of sin for the sake of the gospel? I'll ask you again. Nobody answered. Here's the point. If Timothy's going to go with me, we're going to encounter people that they're not going to listen unless we become like them. And so Timothy, for the love of the gospel, again, I don't want to read that too quick. He took him and he circumcised him. Why? Because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. They all knew that legally he didn't have to be circumcised, but here's what Timothy would say as he would travel. He would say, I want you to get the gospel. And they were like, yeah, well, how big of a deal is the gospel to you? He's like, it's a big deal. I'll do anything for the gospel. Anything for the sake of the gospel. And so he takes really a minor issue and he says, I'm going to wear this, not because I have to, but because my love for you, the love of Christ compels me, that the gospel is worth everything. It's worth anything, that we would do anything short of sin just for an open door to have gospel conversations. And here's the fruit. What's the win? What's the win of being a sensitive family? As they went on their way through the cities, they observed of them, Acts 15. They literally pulled out their garlic salt and tacos, right? And they said, there's a throne in your heart. They probably didn't do that, but something like that, right? They talked about the gospel. They talked about the throne. And as this happened, they talked about the observance. They talked about the decision that had been made at the Jerusalem council. And so the churches were strengthened in their faith, and they increased in numbers what? Daily. I want that fruit. Lives were changed because Timothy was willing to do anything short of sin for the sake of the gospel. Church, we got to be sensitive. We got to be sensitive to the yet to believe. We can't hold them to a standard that Christ holds us to because they don't know what they don't know. We got to come alongside them. Now again, we don't become sin to reach the sinner. That's not what he's saying at all. But what he's saying is we better be really sensitive with each other. We better be really sensitive with the yet to believe so that we can speak their language and meet them where they are, and they all want to be happier tomorrow than they are today. Is the gospel worth everything? For Timothy it was. So two sensitives. We're sensitive to believers. We're sensitive yet to believe. And ultimately, I pray that we're sensitive to the Spirit. Because if we're not sensitive to him, then we're not going anywhere meaningful. But if we are, he'll take us wherever he wants us, and it'll be better than where we are today. And so they go on. They continued on in this ministry. They went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word of Asia. Now, read what I just said. They were forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the gospel in Asia. Does that make any sense? What does God want more than anything? He wants people to hear the gospel. I think there's kind of three roads here that Paul's following, and wherever he goes, what's he going to talk about? The gospel. So that's easy. He's already got his script. He knows what he's going to say. But I want you to imagine it's like he's walking this way and he hits into a brick wall. So sorry, you're not getting the gospel tonight. Sorry. It doesn't necessarily make sense, but God doesn't want the gospel to go this way. Now, how do we know that? Because he says it. We don't know what exactly it means the Holy Spirit forbid him. I think it's like a wall. They were like, all right, let's go. Nope, that's not it. And then they go over here. The text goes on. And when they had come up to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. And again, you're only here, so sorry, it's just you. You also are missing the gospel. It's not going to you. Why? Because for whatever reason, God had a different plan. Anyone have something this week, this month, this year that just didn't go the way that you want it to go? Like a good thing. Like a plan that you thought was the gospel. This was God's call on your life, and you kept stepping out in faith, and you kept hitting brick wall after brick wall. Well, guess what? God's in that too. Now, sometimes that's the enemy. Sometimes that's the enemy trying to thwart God's plans and his purposes, but God's plans and purposes can never be thwarted. God is always, there are no setbacks in the kingdom. There's only setups. I want you to notice the Spirit of God stops him here. I think the Spirit of Jesus stops him here. I think this is Luke's way of saying the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are all working together. I think sometimes we look at our life and we're like, well, if Dad says this, I'm going to go to Mom and ask her what she wants, right? This is Father, Son, and Spirit saying, I have a plan for you. And even though things this week and this month didn't go the way that you want, my plans will not be thwarted. My plans are better. My better is better. So do you trust me? So the text goes on. Jesus did not allow them to go either way. And so passing by Mysia, they went up to Troas and they continued to preach the gospel. And it was there. Maybe Paul was frustrated. Paul's like, God, what do you want from me? What do you want from me? I just want to be faithful. And so a vision appears. The Spirit comes to Paul through this vision, just like he did through Peter in the night. There's a man in Macedonia that's standing there, urging him, saying, come over to Macedonia and help us. Now again, for us in our context, it might not make sense. We're talking about 585 miles. This is not an easy journey. This is a big deal. Paul's like, well, they're here and they're here. Like, how many yet to believe people are between where Paul is now and 585 miles away, right? A lot. Paul's like, I just want to share the gospel to everybody, but God had a plan. Someone else was going there, someone else was going there, but you had to go here. And so this man in Macedonia, similar to Genesis and Exodus and Deuteronomy and Psalms and Isaiah, there's this man saying, would you come? Guys, there's people in our lives that are looking to be happier tomorrow than they are today. They're like the men in Macedonia saying, would you come here? We don't know. We don't know Jesus. We've never tasted and seen that he is good. And here's what the text says. When Paul had seen the vision, immediately Luke now is no longer a narrator doing a research paper. Luke is like, I'm joining. Luke is now a part. And we sought to go over to Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. And it's a powerful prayer. We have those stickers. They're at the Connect Center if you want one. And I love these stickers. They just say this, God, what are you inviting me into today? It's a powerful prayer. I encourage you to pray it every morning when you wake up. I've seen it on water bottles. I've seen it on backs of phones. I've seen it on dashboards. I've seen it on fridges and on mirrors when we wake up in the morning. But what if we just prayed, God, what are you inviting me into today? Now, here's the good news. It'll change everything about your life. I've talked to foster parents that say, I wouldn't be one unless I actually prayed this prayer. Unless I said, Spirit of God, what are you doing? What are you inviting me into? I've talked to people that have moved here, and on many levels, they're like, we don't know. God just told us to move here. God just told us to go, and so we're here. We don't know what God's doing, but here's my promise. If God's doing it, it's better than whatever you were doing. I promise. And it's a prayer that changes not only your life, but everybody's, especially the men and women in Macedonia. And so Paul and Timothy, they go. They take Silas, they take other people with them, and they go over and they say, we will continue to preach the gospel. So what are the implications? I think that's probably the biggest one. Are we praying and are we watching and are we going? Are we led by the Spirit? Are we sensitive? Are we sensitive to Him? Are we also sensitive to each other? Because let's just be really, really honest. Saints struggle, do we not? We are sinners saved by grace. We are saints who still really sin. Every single one of us is broken. Sons of thunder are broken. Sons of encouragement are broken. The reality is all of us are in the same boat. We are desperate and dependent. We fail. We disagree. We got to remember it's okay to disagree on the minors. We don't ever want to disagree on the majors. When we do, it's worth fighting for. But we got to fight and stand but not push. We got to recognize that teamwork really does make the dream work, that we need each other, that it's not just the reconciliation vertically that we need to the Father, but that God reconciled us to Him so He'd also reconcile us together. Guys, we at Vintage Grace will never be the church that God calls us to be unless each and every one of us is actually playing that role. We need you. Now, I love this because God doesn't need us. He's God. But in His infinite wisdom, He's put us together to fight for our joy and for His glory. So let's just recognize that as saints we struggle. Let's be gracious with each other. Let's actually say, I'm sorry. Like when we step on each other, so let's be like, dude, I missed it. I made a minor thing, a major thing, and I wasn't sensitive. And then you know what happens, I find times when I'm like, hey, I'm really sorry, is that's when they say, hey, I'm sorry, I'm just too sensitive, right? It's a real thing. But we gotta say, it doesn't matter. If I hurt you, that's a we thing, not a me thing or a you thing. We're in this fight together. Part of my passion to see racism eliminated in America is because we've been reconciled vertically. And so as the church, at least, we better be reconciled horizontally. There is no Jew or Greek or Gentile. There is no male or female. There is no slave or free man. We are one in our communitas, struggling together, needing each other. I used to love whitewater rafting with my dad. And in whitewater rafting, if you fall out in the middle of a tough rapid, and make no mistake, I think that we're in the middle of tough rapid season as the Church of America. But when you fall in the middle of a real rapid, you know how you get back in the boat? Help! You can't do it. You need someone to reach down and to pull you back up and out. And church, we need each other. And so let's just be transparent and gracious and patient. Let's forgive. Those of us that are holding on to things, let's forgive. Let's not wait till the end of our life to say the right thing. Let's recognize that God is in control of all things. The second one is this. Strengths have shadow sides. Was Paul a gifted leader? He's probably like the best missionary ever. That's all. He was okay, right? Pretty good preacher. Planted a truckload of churches. Wrote most of the New Testament. You think the boy had some gifts? Here's the downside of really gifted people. They cast really big shadows. And by that, I don't mean like good shadows. Because for every strength, I believe there's a shadow side. We use something called Strength Finders as a church for leadership development. And it's true. The bigger the strength that God's entrusted you with, and let's just be really honest. If God gave you a gift that was a strength, well, guess what? It was His gift anyways. You're not that special. You're a sinner. That's who you are. You with me? God entrusts you with that gift for His glory and for other people's good. And so Paul had these great strengths. Barnabas did too. He was a great lover. He was super patient. But sometimes our shadow sides get the best of it. That's why we need people to call us on our crud. We need to open our hearts and our lives and say, hey, what do you see? What are the blind spots? Because nobody knows their own blind spots. You know why? Because you're blind to them. That's like the definition of the meaning. And so in this context, we have to see that our strengths have shadow sides. I think in this Thanksgiving week, I think it's really, really important that we celebrate other people's strengths. You might see other people's strengths sometimes and you don't even think about it because let me be honest, they probably don't think about it because in their world, they're just living out their God-given calling. That's all they're doing. Can I encourage you to affirm somebody this week? To tell somebody, I see this in you, and honestly, they don't even know it's in them because they're just being them the way God designed them to be. Send a text, make a phone call. There was one time, I use this as a joke, someday I'll do it again, but because I love you, I haven't done it in a long time, but I've led worship at Vintage Grace before. Like, it was awful. Like, it was, and I think you can worship with anybody leading, that talent isn't required, but I was so bad, it ruined the morning, right? Like, we gotta serve in our lanes. We got to recognize where God's called us and how He's wired us, and make no mistake, we all have a role to play, and we won't be who God calls us to be unless we all actually play it. And so send a thank you note. Send a text. One of my favorite leaders in my life is actually my dad. My dad and I are totally different. And that's like the best thing in the world. Because here's the reality. My dad, he like thinks before he speaks. It's a beautiful thing. I've never learned that. I don't see the value in it sometimes, right? Like my dad is consistent and steady and faithful. Like I have two speeds, 0 and 100. Like that's all I got. This isn't like a sermon, Drew, right? Like if you hang out with me, it's exhausting, right? And then there's my dad. He's just faithful Andy. And he's totally different. And I see in him everything. I'm like, I got to grow in that. And I'm not diminishing that we should grow, but sometimes you just got to embrace the fact that that's not who we are. And we got to be thankful for the other people that God designed to be that way because we're better together. That's his design so that he gets the glory and we get the joy. The last one is this. This is all about the kingdom. And who is the main character of the kingdom? The king. It's not me. It's not you. It's not even we. It's he. That he will increase when we decrease, when we recognize that. That we recognize that every part of our lives, like your jobs. I mean, I look at your jobs. I love your business owners or your bosses. They're some of my favorite people that I've never met. You know why? Because they pay you to be an everyday missionary. Like they don't know it yet, right? But they actually pay you to go into your prison where you work. They pay you to be a teacher. They pay you to be a banker. They pay you to go in and clean up messes. You know why they do that? They think it's for their bottom line. And make no mistake, I hope you're impacting their bottom line in a positive way. I hope that as Christians, we're the hardest workers they ever meet. But make no mistake, they're actually paying you to be the presence of Jesus where you can go where other people can't. That's what we mean by everyday missionaries. That every part of our life is about the kingdom. It's about the king, that's what our jobs are, that's what our marriages are. Maybe you remember Ephesians 5. We preached it a few years ago. In Ephesians 5, we kind of ruffled some feathers because your marriage isn't about you. Your marriage is for the world. That they would see a picture of the gospel between you and your bride or your spouse. That they would see that and say, I don't have that. I need that. Or even your kids, that your family is not about Hawaii at Christmas break. That's not what it's about. It's about other families saying there's something in that. Why? Because they don't just live for today, they live for an eternity of tomorrows. Your family, your job, your marriage, your neighborhood, it's all about the kingdom. Your successes and your failures and everything in between, it's not about me, it's about him. It's about the king. And what I love is I'm reading this book of Acts and I'm seeing that from Peter and I'm seeing that from Paul and I'm seeing that from Timothy doing anything short of sin. And I'm seeing the way that's working out in not just their lives, but in yours and my lives too. So I want to introduce you to a friend of mine, Judy, who she sees her life. She sees her joys and her brokenness. She says, this isn't about me. This is all about the kingdom. Here's Judy.
Hi, my name is Judy McClurg, and I've been going to Vintage Grace almost since the very beginning. About 12 and a half years ago, I went through a really painful divorce after being married for 30 years. And I just entered into a time of confusion and abandonment and feelings of rejection and trying so hard to figure out what had happened and why, and looking for solutions through my own mental processes and also through just talking about it with other people, and just going through that for 9 long years. And I think what really blows me away is that I could have been a Christian for 38 years and to not have really understood how much of that time I was still sitting on the throne of my life. And it was through a really painful time and experiencing a lot of loss that I realized that I needed to surrender and trust God to bring me through this time. And it's been a real journey. It's been a real journey for me. So 3 years ago, things sort of changed because I was at church and listening to one of Drew's messages, and he made the following statement: God uses our trials to give us an opportunity to trust him. And that was a real shift in my thinking, because up until that time, I was always seeing God through the perspective and through the lens of my feelings and my circumstances and what was going on. And what he really has had to show me is that I'm not the proving ground of his greatness, that he is over and above all things. And I needed to be able to surrender to that, surrender to his sovereignty, to get off the throne of my life and let him have full sway in my life to do what he wanted. Beyond that, as I trusted him more and more, realizing who he is in his glory, realizing who I am apart from him, which is absolutely lost without him, and realizing his love and his forgiveness for me, even in my sad state, and then through that, finding freedom to forgive someone else that had hurt me, realizing that nobody else's sin is greater than my sin, that the ground at the foot of the cross is level, that I'm on same footing with everyone else, and so to receive forgiveness for myself, I have to be able to experience that for others. And from that point on, because I'd experienced real forgiveness and healing, my one desire was to have a time of reconciliation, to mutually acknowledge that we were so lucky to have, so many great years. To just be able to mutually agree to that was something that I really wanted. And I knew I couldn't orchestrate that. And then God literally orchestrated an opportunity for that to take place. And we were able to have a face-to-face conversation and agreement that what we'd had for most of our 30 years was really, really great, and that we could be grateful for that. And that was just, for me, that was like beyond any expectation I could have had for a reconciliation. I felt like it was truly a godly reconciliation, because I wasn't needing an apology, I wasn't needing explanations, I wasn't needing anything other than to just be able to agree that we were so fortunate to have what we had for as long as we had it, and to be grateful. And God allowed us to have that moment.
See, life is hard. And not every story ends with the couple getting back together. We're broken people. I think it's important we recognize that as we share testimonies, not every story has a bow on top that we're like, ta-da! But actually that we believe that God meets us in our brokenness, that God doesn't waste anything. That as he closes this door and as he closes that door, that he's leading us somewhere, that we can trust that his better is really better. And that's hard to live. It's super easy to say, because I say it all the time. But it's so hard to live when doors close and when our world crashes, when we don't get what we want. We have to believe that he's doing something in spite of what we can't see and touch and feel. We got to trust him. And here's what I love, that even as Paul and Barnabas split, because they split, I don't think necessarily God was like, sweet, I'm going to break those dudes up. That wasn't his intent. I think that on some level they did. And what I love is I really believe that kingdom movement on some level doubles in that context. That God even uses that. Because Cyprus got the gospel while Paul went up to Derbe. And two different locations got to hear the gospel for the first time or be reminded of it. And so, church, here's our belief. Our belief that God's better is better. That in our brokenness, in our fallen world, that he's doing something. Piper says it this way, that God's doing 10,000 things in your life right now. You know 3 of them. And so we just trust that he's doing something. And that part of our brokenness and the messiness that we call communitas is because we need each other. Because we need to be broken together. Because we need to pick each other up. And we need to encourage each other. And we need to fight for our joy as a team. And it's not about us. And it's not about me. And it's not about you. And it's all about the King. And he's worth it. His name is above every other name. His name is what, at the end of this world, that every tongue will confess and every knee will bow that he, Jesus, is Lord. And so, church, as we wrap up tonight, would you stand and join with us, reminding ourselves that he alone is worthy of praise. Let's sing.